Okay, so perfect. Thank you, Oakley. Yeah, how are you, everyone? Welcome back. And today we are here for another meetup of Microsoft Excel Power Platform Saudi Arabia. And today I have my friend coming up from UK, Oakley, who will be talking about some great tips and tricks and how can we work smart, not hard with this technology of Microsoft Excel and VBA. So Oakley, he is an owner of Academy Training Solutions, and he has an amazing personality. I was just talking to him right now also, and I was telling him that he worked in British Army, then he was in acting in movies, and then after that he was doing freelancing in AutoCAD. So when I look his profile and his personality, he's an amazing personality. I'll let him only speak about himself, and so he can talk more about him. So just quickly talk about our past events, what has been taking place, and if you have missed it out, then you can feel free to go and check out our past events which were there. And we have some upcoming events as well. Tanya, she will be talking about the secrets of parameter in Power Query on 15th June. And then we have Dr. Karampa, create interactive dashboards in Excel. So she'll be talking about uh, this thing and how we can create the dashboards, how we can manage it, and with one place, and how can we connect it. So it would be great to see those things. And from the community, if anybody is there, you would like to share your superhero skills and help the community, then you're welcome. You'd like to talk anything about Microsoft Office, Power Platform, Azure, or anything related to Microsoft applications which can help us every day-to-day life, then you're most welcome. Please write back to me, and then I'll connect you to you. And you can just enjoy the session. If you have anything, you can just put it in the chat box. I would leave it to Oakley that how he would like to take the questions. uh, so Oakley, how would like to take the questions?
We're such a small group. I think if people want to ask a question, just ask it. I'll see if I can get the chat up on my window so I can actually keep an eye on it all the time. Faraz, if you see something there, just interrupt me and ask the
Sure.
question. Yeah.
Sure. So what I would suggest that everybody, that when you are mentioning the question, just mention the word Q before the question, so it would be easy to identify it in the chat when somebody is looking. So that would be great. And just to inform you that this session is being live streaming right now on YouTube. And if anybody have wanted to check out the session, I'll drop the link of this session in the group chat also. So you can feel free to go and check out the session. So now I'm going to leave the floor to my friend Oakley. Thank you very much, Oakley, for coming. And he will be showing us some amazing tips and tricks. Over to you, my brother.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen now. Okay. Can you see my screen now? Is that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Let me just start my presentation then. Welcome, everybody. Here we are. Anyone who doesn't know where Saudi Arabia is, it's there on the map, at the center of the world, as you can see on that particular map. And what we're going to be talking about today is just some tips and tricks with working with macros. And I say for beginners and experts alike, it's really geared towards the people who are much more on the beginner side, people who are afraid of using VBA, afraid of recording macros. And the idea is that the experts might be reminded of stuff that they'd forgotten about, or maybe never even knew. For the beginners, hopefully you'll never be scared of code again. For the experts, maybe stuff you didn't know or used to know but have forgotten. And of course, like I said, ask any questions in the chat. If you guys are looking at the chat and you do know the answer to somebody's question, go ahead and answer it. It helps out everybody. We're going to be focusing on low code or no code because I find that's the best way for people to learn. Sometimes people, they're scared of looking at the code, and the first time they see the code, they don't understand it, so they then don't ever bother looking again. And I know that because that's what I was like. When I first started using VBA, I looked at the code, and that was a bad mistake. So it took me about 6 months before I even dared look again. Once I learned about how to just record a macro, that kind of changed things. And even today, if I don't know how to do something, if I don't know the syntax for something, I'll just record a macro and find out how to do it, find out how the machine does it, and then compare different ways of doing something and just dive in and have a look at the code and see what the difference is between them in the code. And today I'm going to show you a couple of those, and it will highlight a couple of things that you do where you might think you were doing one thing, but actually the machine is recording you doing something different. So it's useful to know, and useful to know what the actual code is doing, specifically when you've got the differences like that. Okay, enough of me gassing on for now. Let's get on with it. Okay, before we start, a little bit about me. Who am I? Well, you've probably all heard of Oakley. That's not me, unfortunately. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I'm the owner, as Faraz said, of Academy Training Solutions, and we basically do training across the whole of the south coast of the UK and up as far as London, or we used to. And now, since the lockdown, we're actually now doing training basically across the whole of the world. So we can offer training online to anyone, wherever they are. So our customer base has gone from about 50,000 to about 50 million or even more. So that's a good thing. And we shall see what the future holds for all of us. Now, what's my history with Excel? Actually, I remember Excel when it came on floppy disks, as I'm sure a few of you do. And I think it was version 2, Excel 2, way back in history. But I didn't really use it. I opened it up a couple of times and played around with putting stuff in, but I was using it really as a calculator, no more than that. And on from there, really up until about 2006, when I first actually got introduced to Excel properly. And the way I got introduced to Excel was my brother was running a training company, and they actually had a trainer for a brand new big contract, and the trainer didn't turn up. And there was one of 15 trainers that they had to provide for this customer. And at the time I was acting, so he asked me to step in and pretend to be a trainer for a day. And so I did, and found out that it was actually not that different to acting anyway, standing up in front of people, training them, and kind of got into it in that way. And that led me on to learning a bit more about Excel and becoming quite embarrassed about how little I knew about Excel and how amazing it was when I thought it was just a calculator and all the different things that it could actually do. What about VBA? Well, VBA, this goes on another 10 years later almost, when I was running my own training company by then. And I was getting in different trainers to train the VBA. And I realized how difficult it was to find people who could train VBA locally. And some of the trainers were traveling huge distances to get to us. And then on a couple of occasions, I got let down by people either getting, badly delayed in traffic or other things. And I had to step in and do the training myself. And that was a real sort of wake-up call for me that I needed to learn a bit more about VBA so that I could actually train it, even just at a basic level, just in case I needed to. And then I unfortunately got quite good at it. And then the customers started asking specifically for me. So I couldn't actually just use other trainers anymore, which was great because I then learned a huge amount more about VBA. But I still love showing people the basics and showing people the ways to get into it without being scared. So that's the idea of what we're going to be looking at today. First of all, why should we use VBA? Why should we use macros? Well, they save huge amounts of time. Think of code as automation. Imagine if you didn't have any of the buttons at the top of your toolbar in Excel. Imagine if you had to write in the code for every single command that you wanted to use instead of just clicking a button. That would take forever to do anything. So actually, the program itself is made up from code, And they're just little bits of code, and each button, when you click on it, it does something. And that's how you should think of macros and VBA. They're just little bits of code that do what you want it to do instead of what Microsoft thought you might want to do with it. Anything that's boring and repetitive, the machine should do. Machines are great at doing that. The original stuff, the new thinking, the great ideas, the invention, that should come from you. That's something that you need to do. But if you ever have to do the same thing again, the machine should do it for you the second time. If you do this, it keeps your brain fresh, because there's nothing, better at killing your imagination than just doing something that's boring and repetitive and just goes on and on and on. So if you keep yourself doing fresh things and new things, it'll keep your brain fresh. Okay, let's have a look at an example file. So I'm just going to click here, and we're going to talk about, let's imagine we have a weekly report to do, and this is going to be a really simple report. I'm just going to give you an example of the kind of stuff that you might do that we can automate. So we've got a weekly report to do. I'm going to create a new file first of all. So I've just done Control N up there. This is going to be my report. I'm going to have to go to a certain location and find the data that I want. I need to select the data from that file, and I'm going to copy it. I'm going to go back to my other Excel file. I'm going to paste it in. On board yet? Yeah, I am. I'm going to turn it into a table. I'm going to turn that into a pivot chart. And I'm going to put this on a new worksheet and click OK. Now I'm just going to put some details down here. So I'll put the salesperson in there. I'll put the make in there. And I'm going to put the price in there. Okay, so we're kind of getting there to having some kind of report. But it takes forever to do this kind of thing. I'm just going to play around with that a bit, change the design of it to something that you guys can see on the screen. Now what we might do is we might say, well, actually, we need to make this a bit more usable as our report. So I'm going to take age grouping and payment method and month and put them in the filters and come down here if I want to analyze this, and maybe click on Jan and OK. And now I'm just seeing the data for January. This is terrible. This is absolute garbage. And I hope none of you guys are actually doing this, and certainly not doing it every month when you have to do a report, because it just takes far, far too long. So I'm going to close that file down and obviously not save it. I'm going to close this one down as well. And now we're going to have a look at how long it really takes to do the report. So what I have here is I have a workbook set up with somewhere for my data to be pasted into, and a report already there, although it's not showing any data, and just a couple of things over on the right-hand side. So I'm going to go back to my start sheet. I'm just going to click there for a minute, and don't tell people how quick this is. The idea is that you tell people you have to do it working from home, and then you do it in 2 seconds, and then you have the rest of the day off, because everyone knows how long it did used to take you to do this. So what we're going to do here now is we're just going to click on that button. Now, before I do that, I'm just going to go back to these sheets. This one is empty. This one here has no data in it. I click that button there. In the background, that's opened the other file. It's copied it. It's pasted it into this workbook, and it's refreshed the pivot table so I can now see everything on the pivot table and the pivot chart. I'm now going to choose my slices so that I'm filtering the data here. And normally, if I wanted to clear those slices, I'd have to go back to them all individually and click on each one to clear them. But I've made a little button over here that I just click, and it clears all the slices. I've also got another button, because let's imagine that we wanted to change this data. Let me just do that again. If I select all of that and then delete all of those table rows. So that's taken January out of our data here. So this has just got February and March in it now. If I go back to the report and click on this icon here, that also runs a macro when I click on it. So not just this button here, but actually a picture. And in fact, you can make any object run your macros, and that's what we're going to look at. You'll see here that I've got February and March. January has now disappeared. If I want January back again, I can go back to my start sheet, get the data again, and boom, there's January back again. Okay. Let's go back to our presentation. There are a few things that you need to set up before you actually start working with Excel, with macros. Let me just close that one down and not save the changes. First thing you must do is you must save the file as macro-enabled workbook. Now, one of the reasons for that is if you refer to that file whilst you're recording the code, it will refer to it by the name that it's currently called. So if you haven't saved it and it's still called book one, and it doesn't have a file type of macro-enabled, your code is going to record it referring to that file with the bad name. So name everything properly, make sure it's saved where you want to refer to it from in your code before you start recording macros. Prepare the workbook itself. So we're going to set up the structure. We're going to create the sheets that we need. We're going to put the table in that we need, even if it's empty. And we're going to build the pivot table and whatever reports we want before we start recording a macro. Make sure you name stuff. Don't leave your sheets called sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3, and your tables called table 1, and so on. Be very careful about how you name stuff as well. Name it sensibly. And again, all of this must be done before you start recording the macros. So anybody who wants to follow along and do this, let's just start a brand new workbook and let's do that. So I have here got a brand new workbook. And as I said, the first thing to do is to save the workbook. So I just hit F12 and it comes up with the save as, and I'm going to change it to a macro enabled workbook. Now that is important because otherwise the macros I save in the workbook won't be saved if I just try and save it as Excel SX. So I'm going to call this one report. So it's a blank workbook. I'm going to call it report and click save. Now, because I've done this already, I have to replace it, but that's fine. So this one here is now called report. I'm going to put the extra sheets in there. So I'm going to click there to put a couple of extra sheets in, and I'm going to rename them. So this one's going to be called start. This one's going to be called data. This one's going to be called report. Again, like I say, this is a very simple example, and clearly yours will have a lot more stuff in them. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and actually build the report, which will hold, it'll be the empty report, but I'm going to build it putting some data into it. So I'm going to open that other file, which is called sales data. I'm going to select all of the data range, copy it, and yeah, I can now close that workbook and keep the stuff on the clipboard. And now on the data sheet, I'm going to paste it in. And now again, I'm going to turn this into a table. So just Control T to turn it into a table. Now, because I've already created this sheet called report, here's where I'm going to put in my pivot table or pivot chart on that other sheet. So just like we did earlier, I'm going to go to insert pivot chart. And this is going to go on the new, not the new worksheet, but an existing worksheet. And I can now click here and go to the sheet that I want it to go to. Now, those who are observant will notice that I haven't yet renamed this. I'm just going to demonstrate something with that when I actually rename it, this source will update. That won't happen once I start recording macros. So you must make sure everything is named correctly before you start recording the macros. So that's where I want this to go. Click OK. And again, I'm just going to do the same. So I'm going to put price into the values. I'm going to put make into the, let's put it in the legend. No, let's put that in the axis. Go on. And the salesperson in the legend. Okay, now this time I'm just going to leave myself a little bit of space at the top. And the reason for that is I'm going to put slices at the top. And we're going to then clear the slices using a macro to clear them. So the way we put slices on is we have to actually do it from the pivot table, not the pivot chart. And we go to insert slicer, and I'm just going to use the month and the age grouping and the payment. Far, far better to use these rather than just using a filter field. And stick these at the top. Just drag that one out. And I'm holding down the Alt key as I'm dragging these, and that makes them snap into the corner of the cells as I'm dragging them. Now this particular one, I may as well make that 2 columns. Same with this one, just so they're spread over a bit of a different area. And of course I can come up here and change the styles if I want to. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave them as they are. One thing I am going to do though, is I'm going to make this pivot table or the pivot chart so that it does not resize and resize all the columns every time I update this by filtering. So the way we do that is by clicking inside the chart and going to the options and just telling it not to auto fit the column widths when we update it. Now, the reason I've done that is because otherwise, if I choose a slicer, what it will do is it will resize the columns, and that might put one slicer on top of one of the other ones if the columns resize. So do just be careful of those kind of things. And the only way you'd know that is by practicing beforehand. Okay, so we've got all this set up. Now what we're going to do is clean out the data. So the first thing I'm going to do here is rename this table 1. I'm going to call this TBL data. We could call it TBL sales, whatever you like. I'm just going to show you that if I go back here to my pivot table, if I were to say change the data source, you can see that it's now updated and it's now pointing to TBL data instead of table 1. But like I did say, all of this has to be done before you start recording the macros, because the names of things will be hard-coded into the macros when you do start recording. Right, so we're ready to start recording, except for one thing. We're going to take all the data out. So I'm going to select all of these and delete all of those rows. That just leaves me with my table structure. If I now go to my report sheet and I right-click on here and say refresh, it's now empty or appears empty, because I didn't want last month's data in there. I want next month's data in there. Okay. So that's basically what we need to do for the setup before we start recording any macros. Now I'm going to take a look at how do we record. Now there's a few different ways here, and really it's up to you. Just choose whichever one works for you. I'm not going to say this one's the best. I'm not going to say that one's the best. Obviously there's ones that I use all the time, but something else might suit you guys. So the first way we're going to look at is the developer tab. This is the one most people are familiar with. So if I just go back to my file here, now I'm just on the start sheet for that same file there. But if I want to turn on my developer tab, we right click somewhere up here in the ribbon and say customize the ribbon. All we have to do is check that box and click OK, and we're now a developer. And click on there. Over on the left hand side, we can now click that button to start recording a macro. That's the first way. There's another way, which is the status bar. And a lot of people don't realize this, but down at the bottom of your screen in Excel, there's a whole bunch of stuff along the bottom. And this is the status bar. Now yours might or might not show that button there. If it doesn't, just right click. And my advice is tick everything, because most of the stuff up here is useful for you to see. And if you haven't got it ticked, you're never going to know that the machine knows that. Now, the other thing about these is some of them, when you hover over them, they're just giving you information. Others actually light up when you hover over them. The ones that light up are actually buttons, and you can click on them and they do stuff. That one there, when you click on it, you start recording a macro. Now, the downside of this one is you don't know whether you're recording using relative references or not. We're going to talk about that later on. Okay, another way is from the View tab. Now, a lot of people don't realize this one, but you can actually start recording from the View tab. Let's go and have a look. Go to our View tab, and on the right-hand side, we've got an area for macros, and we can start recording a macro from here. So you don't need your developer ribbon to record macros. If you don't like this method down here, you can just use the View ribbon and say record macros, and you can also see whether you're recording relative or absolute from there. Now, the last way is the quick access toolbar. Now, none of these ways, when you hover over them, none of them are showing you a keyboard shortcut to actually start recording a macro, because Microsoft thought that would be a pretty bad idea in case you accidentally pressed that keyboard shortcut and started recording the rest of your life. But what about if we want a keyboard shortcut to say start recording macros? Well, what we can do is we can right click on that button there and add to the quick access toolbar. We now have a record button up there. And if I press Alt on my machine, that would come up with 4. So that would be Alt 4 would run that macro. It's not going to work on my machine right now because that's sharing the screen through Zoom. But Alt 4 would run the macro to start recording. That's the last one I'm showing you, which is a quick access toolbar. Well, now it lets me do that. Okay, perfect. Now, what do we see when we do start recording? Well, we see this dialogue that comes up. And let's just go through and talk about what you need to put in here and why you might put it in. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the macro names. So do give your macros names. Do make them sensible names. You can't put spaces in there. This is machine speak. And don't start with numbers, and be careful about using special characters. Just because if you want to refer to this macro using other code, sometimes those special characters are already used as a command within that language. So sensible names, just run all the words together. Choose a name that's not already a command in Excel. Otherwise, you'll come unstuck as well. What about the next box down? Shortcut keys. Now, some people are a great fan of shortcut keys, particularly for running macros. And I never, ever use shortcut keys to run my macros. Why? Well, I'm going to show you far better ways of running the macros, like putting them on buttons and so on. Now, where do we store the macro? Well, we've got some options there. We've got this workbook, we've got personal, and we've got a new workbook. So in the background, every time you open up Excel, you've actually got a hidden file running, which is called personal. Now, this is a binary file, and it's called personal XLSB. And what this is for is it's for storing any macros that you want to run on any other workbook you've got open. So because you've always got that file open in the background, you can always run any macro that's stored in that location. So if you want to run a macro on any file you've got open, store it in personal. If you want to send this workbook to someone else and let them run the macros, clearly if you've got it stored on your personal, it's not going to work. So you must store it on this workbook. What about new workbook? Well, I don't understand why new workbook is even there, because I'd either want one of those first two options. I either want it so that I can always run the macros, or I want it so that the person viewing the file can always run the macros. I'm really not sure about that new workbook. Okay, let's click on this workbook. So it's going to be stored in this workbook. And the next box down is called description. What should we put in the description? Well, actually, in some programs, when you start recording a macro, it puts in today's date, it puts in your user ID, so it puts in your username. And that's the kind of stuff you should put in there. So put in a date for when you recorded the macro. Put in your name, especially if you're storing on this workbook, so you can send it to someone else. If something goes wrong with the code, who do they get in touch with to say, hey, how do you fix this? Maybe you don't want to put your name in there. Maybe you want to put someone else's name so you don't get bothered. The other thing to put in here is a description of what it's supposed to do. And I also put in updates and modifications I've made to the code. Now, that's really useful for you when you come back to look at this in 6 months' time or a year's time, when you've completely forgotten what you did and how you made that macro. So do put lots of stuff into the description. Now, having said all of that, there's another type of macro that I record if I'm just wanting to see what the code looks like for doing a specific thing. And I refer to them as scrap macros. And the way I know myself what's a scrap macro is I don't actually give it a name. So when I'm looking back at the code later on, anything that's called macro something is a scrap macro and I can throw it away. Okay, let's talk about this absolute versus relative, because I did say that when you're recording a macro, you do have to be careful whether you've got use absolute or use relative turned on. Now in Excel, when we refer to another cell, we refer to it relative by default. In VBA, it's the opposite. We refer to it as absolute by default. Relative will refer to the starting point when you run the macro. So let's just record a couple of macros and we'll see what the difference is between those two. So the first one, I'm going to do this from my developer ribbon. I'm going to make sure that I don't have relative references turned on. And you'll see that's wonderfully easy to see that I don't have them turned on there. And now I do have them turned on. But when I hover over it, it's impossible to know which it is. So make sure you've moved the mouse away before you look to see whether you're using relative references or not. And actually, it's even harder to see when you're in the view ribbon. So if we go here, when we click on that button there, when I show it again, it's almost impossible to know that that's now using relative references. It's actually got a very faint outline around that button there. So when I close it and bring it back again, you can see that it now doesn't have an outline. And unless you know exactly what to look for, you're going to miss that completely. So Microsoft, why don't you make them just light up in yellow like you used to? That'd be a great idea. Okay, so we're not going to use relative references to start with. So that means the default is absolute references. So what's going to happen here? I'm going to start recording a macro. It's a scrap macro. So we're just going to see what the code looks like. And I'm going to click OK. I'm now going to select A1, write my name in there, and stop recording. Just in it so you guys can see that clearer. Okay, that's all I did. So that was the macro. I'm now going to click in that cell there. I'm going to start using relative references, and now I'm going to record another macro. So I'm going to start recording. I'm going to do exactly the same. I'm going to click in A1, write my name in it. And now stop recording. And the thing I always do after using relative references, I immediately turn that button off. The reason is I can now click that button down here to start recording or stop recording. And I know that relative is always turned off. So I'm always referred to macros as absolute unless I go in and turn them on. Okay, so we've recorded our two macros, both doing effectively the same thing, but one using relative, one using absolute references. Now what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at how we get in to look and see the code. So there is actually a code editor, Visual Basic editor, because the code is written in Visual Basic for applications. That's what VBA stands for. And in this case, the application is Excel. So different ways we can get to the code editor. We can get to it from the developer ribbon. So if I click here on the developer ribbon, we can go to Visual Basic, hover over there. It says Visual Basic editor. Another way we can get there is from the View tab. Now, this is slightly more complex because this one only works if you have actually got macros that you've recorded. So if you haven't got any macros in the workbook you're looking at, this way is not going to work. So if we go to View, go to Macros, we can now go to View Macros. And now with whichever one of these I like, I could say Edit, and that will open the Visual Basic editor to look at the code. Now, the last way is the one that I use all the time. And this is the keyboard shortcut. Keyboard shortcut Alt F11 to get in to view the code. Now, you don't have to remember that. All you need to do is find the button, hover over it, and look at what it says in brackets. If there's a keyboard shortcut, it'll be there in brackets. Alt F11. When you do start recording macros, you're going to be doing it so often, you'll just find it completely second nature to do the Alt F11. Let's now have a look at what our macros recorded. So the first one we did is called macro 1. What you see down here in green with the apostrophe at the beginning, that's just a comment, and that will be the name of the macro, and underneath it'll be the description that you typed in. So if you did type in a description, that's where it will be. And the apostrophe and the fact it's green means it's not going to run. This is human speak. The machine skips straight over it when it's running the macro. Now here, the first thing I did was I selected A1. That's what that line of code means. The next line of code, the next thing I did was in the selection, effectively in the formula bar, I wrote in the text, which is my name. That was the first one. And you'll notice that the range A1 is hard coded in. In other words, it's an absolute reference. Now, the one below does it differently because it says from the active cell. In other words, from wherever you are, offset yourself down 1 and left 2, sorry, up 1 and left 2, and then select range A1, in other words, the top left-hand corner of whatever selection you now have. Now, it's going to be a single cell, so we don't need to worry about range A1. In fact, we could just delete that. And then again, with the selection into the formula bar, we write our name. Let's see how this actually works. So I'm going to go back in here. I'm going to click in a cell that's definitely not one I had selected before. I'm going to go to my developer ribbon. I'm going to look at the macros, and I'm going to choose macro 1. And it writes my name in A1. Now I'm going to choose a cell down here. I'm going to look at the macros. I'm going to run macro 2. And it doesn't write my name in cell A1. It goes from where I am, it goes up 1 row and across 2 and writes my name in there. Now this can cause a problem. And the problem is if I now run it again, it doesn't like it. Now the reason it doesn't like it is because it wanted to go up 1 and across to the left 2, and that pushes it off the sheet. So I'm going to stop that. This is why macros generally record in absolute, so that when you're clicking to record the macro, you're clicking on stuff that's actually on the screen, so it's not going to break the code when it does come to run it. Okay, let's just have a look at that code again for a second, and then let's close it down. The code itself is written in what we call object-oriented code. It's an object-oriented language. Now, what we mean by this is if I wanted to speak as a human, I would say, pick up the pen. So the pen as an instruction to somebody, pick up the pen, that's how we'd say it. In English, some other languages are different. Now, the machine speak way of doing it is to talk about the object first of all. So the object is the pen, and then they talk about the action. So pen, pick up. This is what I refer to as machine speak. Now, sometimes you're also going to hear people talk about not just an object, but also a collection. Now, what this means is if we didn't just have one pen, we had a whole load of pens. Pens with an S on the end would be the collection. So I couldn't say pens pick up, otherwise someone would try and pick up all the pens. I'd say pens, that's the collection name, and then I'd refer to the one I want to talk about, the blue one, which might be the name of the pen, or it might be a number in a sequence for how many pens I've got, and then the action. Anyone had too much code yet? I said it'd be low code, no code, and that's too much already. So let's leave the code alone. Let's have a try. Let's try and record some stuff and then go and have a look at the code afterwards. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to record ourselves opening a file. So I'm going to go back here. This again is my report. So it's all set up. So I'm going to record myself opening that data file. What do I need to do before then? I need to check that everything is named properly. Yeah. So I know that my table, yes, go to the table, look at the name. Yes, it's been named correctly. Go to my pivot table. This hasn't been named correctly, so I haven't actually named it yet. So that should be named properly as well. Everything within the file should be properly named. So this is going to be PT sales. And okay. So it is important that you name everything before you start recording the macros. Let's now record a macro. Now this is not going to be a scrap macro, so we're going to give it a name. So I start recording down here. Now, if you just want to be double sure, just check that you don't have relative references turned on. I'm happy I don't, so I just click down here. That starts recording. I'm going to call this one get data. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to open another file somewhere. What am I going to put as a shortcut key? Nothing. Where am I going to store it? I'm going to store it in this workbook. And what am I going to write in the description? Loads of stuff about me, the date, what the macro does, and so on. But in this case, nothing. So I click OK. I am now recording a macro. So what do I do? Well, I'm going to say open. So file, open. Now I can actually go through the process to find that file, or I can just refer to it here from my recent files, and the machine will record the same code. So this is an example where you can try stuff and then go and look at the code and then try something different and have a look at the code just to see if keyboard shortcuts work, if certain things work or not. I'm going to click on there to open my data. I'm now going to choose this whole range of data, but that's going to be a separate macro that we do to choose that. So all I wanted to do was open the file and then stop recording. So that's what I've done. Now I'm going to record another macro, which is selecting, copying, and pasting that data into my other file. But we need to be careful about how we do this. So I'm going to go back to my other workbook. So this is the one that's got the code stored in it. When I start recording a macro and I say this workbook, it's really important that this is the workbook that I'm in when I start recording the macro. Otherwise, it's going to store the code in the other workbook, which is the one I've just opened. So I've gone back to this workbook, and you'd probably do that whilst you're still recording. So now what I'm going to do is start recording again. And I'm now going to record myself changing to the other file and selecting the data. So we're going to call this one select. Select data. Again, no keyboard shortcut, store in this workbook, which is this one, which is the one that's macro enabled. Click OK. Now I'm recording myself changing to the sales data workbook. So I'm still recording, changing to the sales data. Now what I want to do is I want to get this range of data here, however big it is. So I don't want to physically select a range of data. I want to get it however big it is, because next month it'll be different size. Last month it was a different size, and so on. A couple of different ways that people can do this. The first thing is to select a cell that we know is always going to be inside that range of data. And guess what? A4 will always be in that range of data. But unfortunately, A4 is already selected. And the reason A4 is already selected is because that's the cell that was selected when this file was saved. But it won't always be. Somebody might come and click over here as a cell and then save the file. And if my code then tries to select the range of that cell there, it's not going to work. So we have to be very careful. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the cell next to it and then go into the code and change B4 to A4. Now from here, what I can do is I can give a keyboard shortcut that will select that whole range of data. And I'm going to do Control A. That's selected that whole range of data. And now what I'm going to do is stop recording. Now, the reason I've stopped recording there is this is one of those things where what you think you've just done, the command you think you've just given the machine, might not be the actual command that the machine thought you gave it. I'm going to go back to my other workbook. We're going to record another macro, and we're going to do this one slightly differently. So this one is going to be select data 2. I'm very imaginative with my names. Click OK. We're going to change workbooks. Once again, we're going to choose B4. We're going to change it in the code to A4 later on. And now this time, rather than Control A, I'm going to do Control asterisk. And you'll learn that actually that's what you should be doing all the time when you look at the code. So again, I just stop recording. Right, let's go back to our first workbook. And let's have a look at the code. So Alt F11 brings up the code. And we're not going to worry about these ones here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete them. Not that one. We want that one. But we don't want those two. And one way I can know that they're the ones to be deleted is they're scrap macros. They're still called macro something. And all we need to do is delete it there, and it's gone. Now down here, this is where we selected the data. So the first one, it says go to the other workbook. In fact, it says the other workbook, activate it, go to it. And then down here it says, it doesn't say select B4. It actually has hard coded in the whole range of what we want to select. And then at the end of that, it says B4 activate. That doesn't really make sense. That was our Control A. Control A hard codes in the current range of that data. That's why you shouldn't be doing Control A, especially when you're recording a macro. What you should be doing is Control asterisk, because the code here says select the other workbook with the data in it, go to range B4, which is where I'm going to change it to A4, and then with the selection's current region, in other words, however big it is now or going to be in the future, we want to select it. So that's a great one. That's the one we're going to keep, and that's the one we're going to run when we actually record a master macro. Okay, let's have a look at what else we want to do next. So once we've selected that data, we then want to copy and paste it. So we've opened the file, we've selected the range, we've looked at the difference between Control A and Control asterisk. We're now going to copy and paste, and we're going to paste it into our existing report data sheet. So not this one, but that sheet there is what we're going to paste it into. Now I want the machine to record me actually changing sheets as well. So in order for it to record me changing sheets, I need to not already be on the data sheet. So I'm going to start from my start sheet. I'm also going to record myself changing to the other workbook to get the data to select it. So we've already gone in and selected the data. So I'm going to make sure I'm positioned in the right place before I start recording the macro. So I've already got that data selected on that workbook before I start recording the macro. So I'm happy that's all set up correctly. I'm now going to start recording. This is going to be called, let's call it copy paste. Again, we're going to store it in this workbook, no special characters or spaces or anything like that, and click OK. Now we're going to go and do that. So we just go to the other workbook. We've got it all selected already. So we just copy. And now we're going to record ourselves changing back to this workbook and changing to our data sheet and pasting it in. Now, you might notice this is going to do something quite bizarre. So Control V, in that it pastes in a second row of headers. So we're going to look at a different way of doing this with the code later on. Okay, that's all I want to do for pasting it in, so I stop recording. Now what I'm going to do is just delete that row there. Now, if I'm always going to have to do that, I would record myself doing this as well. Yeah. So I'm going to say, well, let's do that. Let's just say record ourselves, and let's call this delete row. Okay. So we're going to go here. We're going to select that row, right click inside the data, delete, and it's gone. Now, what we could have done there was, instead of deleting the entire row, we could have selected inside here, inside the table itself, and then deleted the table row. So I'm still recording, so I'm going to do both, and then we'll have a look at the code and we'll decide which one might be better. Now I'm going to stop recording. Let's do the last stage, which is then going to be going to our report sheet and telling this to refresh. So from the data sheet, I need to not already be on the report sheet if I want to do this. So in fact, I'm going to do it from the start sheet. Once more, start recording. This is going to be called refresh data. And I click OK. So the first action is to change to the report sheet. I'm now just going to right click, if it lets me do that, and refresh the data. And stop recording. Okay, that's pretty much recorded all of the macros that we're going to do for now. So let's just have a look at what they do. Let's have a look at the code itself as well. But before we do that, I need to clean this out a bit. So I need to actually go through here and remove all of these rows and go back here and refresh this. So it's back to our blank report sheet. Let's have a quick look at the code. So Alt F11. We've got these in order. So the first thing is getting the data, and it basically says open that file. That's the file. We've got it stored in the right place there. The second one says go to that file and get the current region for A4. Now, this is the bit that we might change later on, or we might just say use that removing the extra row. We copied the data, we pasted it in, and here's where we deleted the row. Now, this first one here said rows 2, select and delete, and that was fine. The next one said list rows 1, delete. Now, the difference between these two is that deleted row 2, always row 2. This one here selected B2 and then deleted the first list row of my table. So my list object, list row 1, was what got deleted. So we can do either one. We don't need to do both. We certainly don't need to do both. And what we're going to do, in fact, is the second one, which removes the first row of our table object. Next one down just says refresh everything. So selected that sheet and it's activated the chart one, chart one, chart one. So we don't need that to be done 3 times. And in fact, we don't need to select the sheet at all. So we can just delete them. All we really want to do is we want to refresh the pivot cache for the pivot table, and that will update our chart. Now, the other thing we want to do here is we want to look at how we run these macros. So it's all very well having them recorded, but how do we actually go ahead and run them when we want to? So let me just come back to that one. A couple of different ways again. Keyboard shortcut. I've talked about this one already. I don't like using keyboard shortcuts to run macros. And the reason is because almost every keyboard shortcut already does something useful. And I found in the past that when I put a macro on a keyboard shortcut, that might be someone's favorite keyboard shortcut. And what they end up doing is pressing that keyboard shortcut and running my macro instead of the thing they thought they were going to do. So I stay away from keyboard shortcuts to run macros. We can put macros on the quick access toolbar. So let's have a look at that one. From here on my start menu, I might be able to put something. So I've gone to more, quick access toolbar. Now from here, I can say, let's have a look at the macros, and I can choose which macro I want. Now let's just say the get data. And if I say add, that will put a button on the quick access toolbar that will run my macro. And that's great. Click OK. And we see the button there. When I hover over it, it tells me the get data. But if I put another one up there, it's going to have the same icon. So if you do that, always change the icons. So update this, modify it, and choose an icon that kind of means something to getting the data, maybe a file or something like that. And this here, where it says display name, this is human speak. So this, you might say, get sales data from file, something like that. I'm going to type in get data from file and click OK. And what I mean by display name is when you hover over it, that's what comes up in the tooltip. So you can be even more specific than that. And this is much more helpful when you've got various different macros running along the top there. We're not going to do that. I'm going to remove that one. Other ways you can do it. So what you can do is not just a QAT, but you can put in a custom ribbon which has all of your macros in it. So if you've got lots and lots of macros, you may as well make your own ribbon and put those in it. So how do we make our own ribbon? Well, right-click, customize the ribbon, just where we went to turn the developer on. And now all we do is we say, let's make a new tab. And let's rename it. So I'm going to rename that tab. I'm going to give it my name. And click OK. You'll notice it's now named with my name. I'm now going to name the group as well. And you notice that there are no buttons directly on the ribbon. They're all within groups on the ribbon. So I'm going to take that group and rename it. And this might be called Weekly Report. So I then put all the macros to do with the weekly report in that group. I might have another group called monthly report. So let's make another group and let's call this one monthly report. And I'll click OK. And OK again, and we get our new ribbon, and it's called Oaks, and it's completely useless because I haven't put any buttons on it yet. So right-click, customize the ribbon. Let's go down to the group that we want the buttons to go into. And now instead of these commands here, again, we're going to go to macros. We're going to choose our macros, and we're going to put them in there. So the first thing I want to do is get data. So I say add that one. And then I want to select the data. Then I want to copy paste. Then I want to delete the row. And I want to refresh. So I've got all of those buttons on there. And of course, you'd now go through here and rename and choose different icons for them as well. Now, when we look at our custom ribbon, we've got all of these different macros on here with their wonderful custom names and custom icons as well. So that's another way of actually running your macros, by putting buttons up there to run the macro. Now, with both of these, they're quite specific because these are going to stay on your machine. They're going to be available on any file that you're working on. So that's handy, but not if the code is in this workbook and you don't have this workbook open. So if you've saved a macro on personal and you want it to be available on any file you've got open, these two ways are fantastic, having it on the quick access toolbar or on a custom ribbon. But again, with this example, that's not what we're going to be doing. So I'm going to customize the ribbon. I'm going to choose that one and delete it. So right click on it and remove. And click OK. My wonderful ribbon has now disappeared. So let's see what we are going to do. Well, we're going to put a button on the screen that's going to run the macro. So we can either put, well, in fact, we can use any object. So we can either put a button on here from the developer ribbon. This is what people used to do, is say insert and choose a form control and choose a button from here. And you really don't need to do this, because what you can do is you can insert any object. So you can insert a picture. And if I say just insert a picture from this device, and I'll find that picture and put it on, that picture, I can now make the object that runs my code. And the way we do this is by simply right-clicking on it and say assign macro. Now I could say I want this one here to be the one that gets the data, and that will now have a macro on it. And the way we know an object has a macro on it is as soon as we hover over, we get the little pointy finger that tells me if I click now, it's going to do something. That makes it very difficult to move the object around. So when you have put a macro on a button, the way to move that object now is to right click and then left click. Now you can move it. Otherwise, it's really frustrating when you just try and click and drag and it does whatever you told it to do with the macro. Now, the other way of doing this is a different type of object, which is just a button. So we could go to Insert and Shapes, and I'm going to use that one because I always use it. It's a rounded corner rectangle. I'm holding down Alt as I drag, and that fits it to the cell sizes. As soon as I've finished drawing the shape, so this is going to be my one that selects data. So as soon as I finish drawing the shape, with it still selected, I just start typing in, and that puts the text inside the shape. I then click away from it, click back into it, and then on the home ribbon, I can center and middle it, and then resize the text so that it just stands out a bit better. Now, at the moment, this is just a shape. It's not a macro button, but if I right click on it, assign macro, and then choose a different one. So this is the one that says select data. So I'm just going to say select data and OK. Now, the other useful thing about this one is remember that we can use our Alt if we click and drag to move it. So we can hold down Alt and it will snap in. But if we also hold down Control, it will actually make a duplicate. So we can make several duplicates to make a list or a bunch of buttons, and then just go into each one and rename them and perhaps reassign the macro that it refers to. I'm not going to do that with this because I want to do something specific here. Let me just select that one and delete the whole of it. You do have to be careful here not to left click when you're doing that. And in fact, I'm going to leave that one there and delete my little owl. Now this one here, we actually don't want it to have that macro on it. Now, there's nothing here that we can do to deselect that macro, but what we can do is select all of that, and it now has no macro assigned to it. So if I hover over it, I don't get the pointy finger anymore. That's how I know I don't have the macro assigned to it anymore. And I'm now going to call this run report, because that's what I want it to do. Now, the reason I've done that to put it all on a single button is I'm now going to actually record a master macro. And this master macro is going to be me running all of those macros. Now, the reason I've deleted all those buttons is because actually you can't record yourself clicking on a button and running the macro. So you have to do it from one of the other methods, and we're going to do it from the developer ribbon. So I'm going to go to the developer ribbon, go to macros, and choose the macro that I want myself to run as I record it. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to start recording. I'm going to call this master. Going to be in this workbook. Going to click OK. I'm now recording. So I go to my macros, and I want to do the get data. That's the one that opens the other file, and I'm going to run it. I'm now going to switch back to my start sheet, make sure I'm in this file on that sheet, and I'm now going to run my next one. So macros. The next one was selecting the data. And that changes me to this one, selects all the data. And now again, I'm going to record myself changing back to this file. I'm going to go macros. So I've selected the data. I then want to copy and paste. So it's that one. And run. So I've copied it, I've pasted it, and I'm back on this sheet. I'm going to go back to my start sheet and still recording. I'm going to run another macro. So it's copied and pasted. I'm now going to delete that row. That's caused a problem because I changed sheets. That's absolutely fine. What we'll do is we'll fix that later on. So I'm just going to say end, and I'm still recording, but we can fix that in the code. Another macro. So we've deleted that row. We're now going to refresh. What you've got to be very careful of is you don't try and run the macro you're currently recording. Stop recording. Let's just have a look at the code and we'll see what that actually recorded. So all it's actually done is it's recorded me running a macro and then changing a sheet, running a macro and then changing a sheet. So if we think about the one that gave me a problem, it was the one where I changed the sheet in between doing a couple of things. So what we didn't want to do was go back here before we cut row 2, which was deleting the row. So we did need to do that copy paste, and we didn't need to do that lot there. So I'm just simply going to delete those from the code. And now we can actually put all of that on the button, but this is our master macro that we put on the button itself. So let's go back there and have a look. On here, we're going to go to the start, we're going to right click, and we're going to assign the macro, which is called master. Click OK. Now, in order to see if this works, and there's absolutely no guarantee that it is going to work, so I'm going to right click here, delete all the rows. So we're just back with the one row there, and just so that we can see that without the header on there, I'm just going to clear the formatting off there. We're going to go back to our report. We're going to right click and we're going to refresh. So it's refreshing with the no data. And this has got no data. And on our start screen, we've got our run report button. So now if we just hit the button, it will run the report, running all of those individual macros. And we can do this in one go, or we can actually step through the code and look at it. We're going to try it. We're going to try and run the report. Like I said, there's no guarantee it is going to work. We might have to go and look in the code to see if it does. But actually, that worked fine. Now we can apply our slices to the data. And I've just put 3 different slices on here. And that was a really bad choice because that meant nothing is showing. Choose more than one. Okay, so we've actually got something showing. And the last thing we're going to do here is we're going to record another macro that actually clears all of those slices. And that we're going to put on a button over here that just says clear. So let's go ahead and do that. Easy enough to do. Click in a cell that's not having one of these selected to start with. Start recording. We're going to call this clear slices. And click OK. We're going to store it in this workbook, obviously. Click OK. And now we're going to clear that one, and then clear that one, and then clear that one. That's it. So we stop recording. Now we're going to put a button over here. This will be an easy button. So insert, shapes, round a corner rectangle. I'm holding down Alt, so it snaps to cell sizes. And straight away, clear slices, click away, click back on the shape, go to the home ribbon, center, middle, make it bigger and bolder. Now we right click, put right click in the right place, assign macro. Now we want this one to be clear slices. Click OK. Now if I apply different slices, as soon as I click that button, it will clear all of those slices. So this makes life a lot easier when you're working with reports. Basically, you record yourself doing stuff, and then you just run it when you next want to do it. We could record ourselves deleting this to clear the data at the end, but actually you don't need to, because what you'd do is you'd start your report from an empty file every month. So rather than updating last month's file to make this month's, you just simply open from a template perhaps and run a new report. Okay, let's jump back to our presentation. Okay, here's another couple of examples of things you might want to do recording macros. Monday morning, you get into the office. You might say that every Monday morning you have to open these half a dozen different files and they're all in different places. That's the kind of thing you should record yourself doing. And then next time, just click a button, let the machine do it for you. Yeah. Things like saving files as PDFs. Again, it's a small thing. It might save you 10 or 20 seconds each time you do it. But these are the kind of things that really, really save you time when you've got it recorded as a macro. Anything else? Well, the sky's the limit. Whatever you want to do, if you can do it, if it's a repeatable action, you can just do it. Record yourself doing it, and then the machine will do it again for you. Okay, what about things you can't record? Well, you kind of can, but you can't actually record yourself doing things multiple times because the machine will record exactly the same number of times that you did it. But there are things called loops. You can record the thing you did once, and then all you need to do is build a loop around it. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's have a look at an example. So this is the file that had the data in it. Now let's imagine that we didn't know how many header rows there were going to be at the top. So sometimes there might be 2, sometimes there might be 3, sometimes there might be 5 header rows at the top. But we don't know. But what we do know is that the one that matters starts with the text NO. What we can do is we can start at that first cell. And we can then say, move to the cell below. And we can carry on doing this until the cell we've got selected has the text NO inside it. So let's record ourselves doing that. We'll record the first bit and then we'll wrap it in a loop. The first thing I'm going to do is start recording. This is just going to be a scrap macro. We're just going to have a look at this and we click OK. I'm going to select A1. Now, I want to now select the cell below where I am. So if I just did that now, that would select A2. But because it's an absolute reference, it would always select A2. That's not what I want. I want it to select the cell below where I am. So I'm going to go to my developer ribbon. I'm going to use relative references. And now I'm going to select the cell below where I am. And now I'm going to stop recording. So let's just have a look and see what that code looks like. So Alt F11, we're going to go right down to the bottom of here. In fact, it's going to be on a new module. And what it did was it recorded me absolutely selecting A1. And then from my active cell, which is A1 in this case, go down one. And I don't need that range A1 because it's only a single cell. So I want to keep doing that. I want to go to the cell A1 and I then want to keep selecting the cell below until the selected cell or the active cell equals the text NO. So we're going to basically put in what's called a loop here. So I'm going to say do until. Then I'll put in the criteria for what I want. So do until active cell value, and we can choose from the code prompt. So if the active cell value equals the text NO, and here I'm going to say active cell value plus, that's me being very well, and now I'm just going to say loop. So it's going to keep doing that until it finds the cell with the value no in it. Now I'm just going to put a stop in there so that we can have a look at the code as it runs through. Now the first bit of code is going to go to A1 and then it's going to go to the cell below, the cell below, the cell below. Now let's actually see how we can look at it while it's doing this. And the way we can do that is by not clicking that button there, but by stepping through it. And if we go to the if I press F8 on my keyboard, I was looking to see if I could show you the keyboard shortcut up there. It's not coming up on the Zoom. So F8 is the key to step through the code. So the line of code that's highlighted is the next one that's going to run. So if I now press F8 again, the next line it's going to run is it's selecting A1. So it's now selected A1. Now it's going to do this. It's going to keep selecting this next bit and looping back until the selected cell equals no. So press F8. Does it equal no? Not true. So it selects the next cell. Loop back. Does it equal no? Keeps going down until eventually it gets to the cell that does have no in it. And now it's going to jump out of the loop because it's finished. So what I would do there is I'd write another line of code in here, which would basically be saying, okay, now you've done that. You found the cell that we need. Now select everything. So active cell, current region, select. And the people who are familiar with code, they're going to hate me for doing this because selecting cells, every time you select a cell, it's very, very slow. And they'd be saying, oh, what you should be doing is just looking at the cell. Absolutely. But you can't record yourself just looking at the cells. What we did there was we recorded ourselves selecting the cell. Now, if I step through the code here, so again, my F8, 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 can you keep going through until it gets to the one that does say no or number? Jumps down to that one, and now it selects the active region for that one that it's found. Okay, that's something that you kind of can't record yourself doing. You can't record the loop, but you can record the bit that goes in the loop and then come back to it. So you can build the loop around that. Let me close those down. A couple of other things that you can't record yourself doing. You can't record yourself sending a message to the user, but you can actually write that in the VBA. So in the VBA, you can just put a message box which gives the user some information. That might be a warning about something, and you're familiar with those warning boxes that come up. You can write your own, and the code for that is just message box, MSG box, and then what you want. You also can't record yourself getting input from the user. You can't record yourself building a form. Maybe you want to get more than one bit of information from the user. You want to get a whole series of things, so you can build a form that will do all of that for you. Okay. There's a lot of people who constantly think that VBA is finished. They think VBA has been around far too long. There's new codes out there. We don't want to use VBA anymore because it's an old-fashioned form of code, so let's get rid of it. Every time Microsoft say they're getting rid of it, it's such an upcry that they have to keep it. So I don't believe it's going anytime soon. I do believe VBA is here for a while. People do say VBA is dead. Not a big fan of that. I think it's going to be here, like I say, for quite a while. People do say the king is dead. I don't believe it. Okay, hopefully that's been a bit of a rush through, but a brief overview of looking at the code, how you go about recording a macro of you doing something, making your life easier, I hope. Anybody got any questions? I haven't had a chance to look at the chat. Hopefully somebody's been answering questions that people have been asking. Please do feel free to unmute yourselves and just shout out if you do have any questions. What do we think?
There was one question. I was just going to chat. That was wonderful, Oakley. Wonderful. Okay, so there is one question. Can't you create a dynamic structure to skip all of the steps for that? It's from Patterson. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
I'm just scrolling back up to see.
Yes. Hey, what's up, Oakley?
Yeah, hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. Yeah, I was just wondering, like, when you were saying how you have to be very specific about, like, all the name ranges and the pretty much everything you're doing is prep work, it seemed. Is there a way you can skip having to do all that with the dynamic structure? I don't know. I was just kind of thinking about that while you were
you can basically, so remember what I did at the beginning of the presentation. So I recorded myself copying and pasting and turning it into a table, turning it into a pivot table and doing that all. You can record yourself doing that. But if you straight away then try and run that, it's going to crash. And the reason it's going to crash is because you recorded yourself creating table 1 and then creating pivot table 1. And as soon as you then try and run it, you try and create table 1 again, and you can't have the same name used twice for the same object or for different objects. So it becomes an ambiguous thing. Now, what you can do is you can record yourself doing it once. And if you're very precise about immediately naming everything, that will all get done in the code. So that is then allowable. So yeah, you can basically, I've accidentally recorded over an hour of work one day, and I just hit the button to test it and see if it would play back and actually run what I'd done for the last hour, and it did. Yeah.
Okay.
Did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
You just have to be careful. Most of the stuff, the big problem is going to be the naming, because you can't, if you've referred to it incorrectly in the code, it's hard coded in.
Yeah.
But you can always go through it, and find and replace works in the Visual Basic editor. So if you do rename something, you can just do find and replace table 1, replace with TBL sales data, and that'll work.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Yeah, I was trying to think of a way to make it faster, really.
For actually making the VBA code faster or making recording it faster?
Both.
If you want to make the code itself run faster, there's a lot of different ways, and there's a couple of YouTube videos out there which show how to increase the speed of running the code by 1,000-fold. And the biggest one is to not actually do stuff that's going to be displayed. So you change the code from selecting objects to just looking at them. But that's much more of a knowing VBA and writing VBA rather than recording a macro and just running the macros.
Say if you just did hide all display alerts, wouldn't that make it a lot faster?
Definitely. That's one of the simple things, one of the easy way of doing it. But again, you can't record yourself writing, hiding the display alerts. But if you know the code, it's really easy to type it in. Yeah. Application display alerts false equals false. And screen updating as well. You can turn that off.
Yeah. Ignore on error too for certain things.
Oh, yeah. On error, resume next. It's a disaster. Don't do that. You want to see the errors, particularly when you're testing the code. You want the errors to come up so you know that they're going to come up for the customer or whoever the customer might be later on. You certainly don't want to just get in the habit of putting on error, resume next as a default. There's a question in the chat from Frano, and it says, would it be easier to do all this with Power Query and Power Pivot? This is a common thing I get asked, and it's one of the reasons why I chose this topic to do for this presentation. There's a lot of people who become very specialist in their chosen part of Excel. There are some people who are absolutely brilliant at Power Pivot. Some people are brilliant at Power Query. And that's fine. But the analogy I use is that's like a builder turning up with a screwdriver. They might be the best person for using that screwdriver in the world. It might be the most fantastic screwdriver. But what about when they need a hammer? They haven't got it because they just use a screwdriver. They're an expert on a screwdriver. So my sort of thing I try to get everybody to do is to turn up with a toolbox. Turn up with a toolbox with everything in it. VBA is completely different to Power Query. Power Query is for looking at stuff. VBA is for doing stuff. So VBA and Power Query, you can't really compare the two and say, oh, Power Query is going to replace VBA. It's not. Now, the exact example I gave you, absolutely some of that can be done with Power Query. But that wasn't the point. The point was showing you stuff that can be recorded to then not have to write the VBA to record the macros, which are you doing stuff. Yeah. How do you save a file as a PDF? Well, you record yourself saving it as a PDF. How can you do that in Power Query? You can't. So there's lots of examples like that. Yes, that particular example can be done in Power Query. No, you can't replace VBA with Power Query. There are other languages that you can use instead. You can use TypeScript. If you want to do everything online, VBA doesn't work. So VBA doesn't work at all in the online version of Excel. In that case, you're going to have to learn JavaScript or TypeScript or Office scripts or whatever they're calling them this week. They've got a fair bit to be developed before they're as good as VBA. Power Automate is another answer. Yeah. Any other questions in there for us? Did you?
I was just checking. There's some chats, on the YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody really enjoyed the session. Romeo, I've mentioned thank you, and they really liked the knowledge you have shared. Data scientist, he says hi, and a lot of appreciations in the chat box. So, any final words and any questions are there? So before we end the YouTube session, any questions, anything is there? We'll be still live on Zoom.
Still live on Zoom, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll be live on Zoom, but we'll be ending the session on the YouTube.
I see, yeah.
Yeah. So I think...
I'm just scrolling through the chat here, looking and seeing what people do.
So I think it was great, Oakley. It was great to have you here. And it was a wonderful session, really, even I'm a very big fan of VBA, and even though I do a lot of Power Query stuff and Power Automate, but at some point, you really need a VBA to, handle your business task where you, rather than uh, you do it, let machine do it for you. I'll add one more example. In my daily routine, what I do is that I have written some formulas in Excel for the monthly reports or weekly reports. Now, I don't want somebody to tweak that formulas, and I want them to remain. So what I do before I send the file, I just make sure that that specific range is copied as a value and pasted as a value, so that when you send it, it goes actually as a value.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
somebody can use the file, he can play around with the file. And so that is one example I would like to add it.
Yeah,
And
Faraz,
in
I've got an
rest
example
of,
of that, and I always say you can try as hard as you like to make your file idiot-proof.
yes,
You can't make it idiot-proof. You can make it idiot-resistant. You'll never make it idiot-proof.
yeah,
And however hard you try, someone will find a way of breaking it. And what you said there is a really, really good way of making it as idiot-resistant as you can.
yeah,
Yeah, I do the same. Now, another way of doing that is to have the formulas all in the VBA.
yeah,
So then there's no formulas on the sheet itself for people to break. People can type stuff over what's in the sheet. And if you want it to go back to being correctly calculated, just click the button that runs the VBA and boom, it's all back to what it should be.
yeah,
And so it's another way of making it idiot resistant.
yeah.
But they'll always find a better quality of idiot. Go again.
Sorry?
Do you usually protect your VBA code?
Depends who I'm giving it to. If I'm writing it for a customer and I want them to be able to understand it and edit it, then I don't protect it at all. If I'm writing it for to be shared, like YouTube stuff, then again, obviously I don't protect it. If I'm doing it for a customer as a demo and I don't want them stealing it, then I'll actually do a number of different things. I'll protect it, and I'll also put a timestamp in it. And so that if I haven't gone back in and edited and taken out the timestamp within a certain period of time, every time they run it, it just comes up with a message saying you haven't paid for this. You're not allowed to use it. So I can quite happily give a customer some full working code. And then if they don't ever get back to me again in the future, I know that a month later, it's just going to stop working and I don't have to worry. And in those kind of cases, yeah, I protect the code. But again, you've got to be aware that protecting VBA, it can be taken off.
This is why I'm asking.
Yeah. So, yeah. Do you protect your worksheets?
Not
No.
Not lately.
Have you ever been sent a PDF that doesn't allow you to print it?
Yeah.
Doesn't allow you to save it or edit it? Well,
Yes.
you just take the protection off. It's really not hard.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Great. So, Oakley, and I would just like to thank one person, Alan Murray, today, because he was helping me behind the stage. He was today my co-host. Thank you, Alan, so much. So when I was presenting it during that time, Alan was taking care and he was being a co-host today. Thank you, Alan, so much. And thank you, Oakley. This was wonderful session, and I'm getting some responses on YouTube. You can even check the chat later on also from the YouTube also.
Brilliant, I will, yeah.
So people are really happy, and in fact, even I'm also very happy. At that absolute and relative reference, it was really cool. And my friends, those who are there in UK, you can anytime go and meet Oakley. You can even go and take training from him. He has a great academy, and he has really good solutions over there, and you can attend his training. So, any last words for our friends from YouTube? Oakley?
Thanks for attending. Thanks for asking your questions and interacting and answering questions in the chat. Yeah. Hope you found it useful and hope you use it.
Yeah. Okay, friends. So we are turning off from YouTube now. Take care. Bye.